in media culture and communication. This is my colleague here, Angela Wu. She is also in my department, Media Culture and Communication, here at NYU. And I'm not going to introduce us at length. You all got the invitation. You can click and see the kinds of work that we did. Just really briefly, I'm a cultural anthropologist. I look broadly at, you could say, the psychic life of digital technology, and I've focused on addiction, anxiety, affect modulation, this sort of theme in my work. I wrote a book about called Addiction by Design, about gambling technology in Las Vegas. And Angela is a communications scholar who's working in fields of critical data studies, platform studies, political economy of media and media governance, and she has a set of international projects, many of them focusing on China, and she just got tenure, so yay, Angela. And the main stars of the event tonight are, we decided on this seating arrangement where as Meredith put it, the interlocutors are at the end and the main speakers are next to each other there. You see their books, which have this lovely aesthetic kinship. You know, for all their distinctions and rich differences, they've got these great covers that evoke each other. So thank you both so much for being here. I want to say that there are so many podcasts, articles, interviews that are out there that you can all listen to, in which they really dive deep into their books. What we want to do here tonight, we certainly want to dive deep, but we want to do something different, right? Put these books in conversation. They're not necessarily on the surface. It's easy to think about putting them in conversation. Upon reading them, we learned it wasn't so easy, but far more interesting. So hopefully that'll come out this evening. So we've got Meganets, How Digital Forces Beyond Our Control Commandeer Our Daily Lives and Inner Realities by David Auerbach, and More Than a Glitch, Confronting Race, Gender, and Ability Bias in Tech by Meredith Broussard. Meredith is a data journalist and associate professor here at NYU at the Journalism Institute. And she has a prior book called Artificial Unintelligence, How Computers Misunderstand the World, which I recommend highly. It won some prizes. David is a writer, technologist, and software engineer who draws on his experience at Microsoft and Google in writing this book. And he's written in many places, Times Literary Supplement, The Nation, Slate's technology columnist, etc. And his first book was called Bitwise, A Life in Code, which we also highly recommend. So I think we're just gonna get started. I'm just gonna introduce the books briefly, and then we're gonna kind of trade off questions and inviting you both to answer, and then we're gonna leave time for you to ask questions as well. So, both these books came out in March. Please don't leave without picking up a lovely flyer here with QR codes and such. As I said, this is a really interesting pair of books to put in conversation because they're both offering powerful critiques of big tech, just to put it really broadly, as it's operating at this juncture in history, at this moment. But they're offering these critiques along quite different tracks. So I'll just flag some of the differences in those tracks. They have different units of analysis, different scales of analysis. They're chipping away at related but slightly different technological myths. And they're presenting different kinds of empirical material to tell their stories, and offering different recommendations. The fact that I've used the word different so many times does not indicate opposing in any way. They could be characterized, I think Angela and I were playing around, what is the word? Is it complementary? And we decided the best word is supplementary. I think that they're supplementary to each other in how they show the complexities and dilemmas of the socio-technical systems that are shaping our lives. And they're offering usefully different entry points and vantages onto the complexities and dilemmas of those socio-technical systems. So I'm going to hand this mic down to Angela. It's already on for you, and you can get us started with the first question. And thank you all for being here.
So here comes the first question. But so first, we note the different perspectives that each author take as they approach their subjects. For example, David's unit of analysis is the Meganet, and he'll talk about that with us in a moment. So he tracks digital forces as they sprawl and shift across the planet, showing up in online gaming world's spheres of cryptocurrency, and a range of international contexts, such as India and the Philippines and China, where I noted David was more careful than most in contrasting the much hyped dark fantasies with the reality. Meanwhile, Meredith zooms in on how specific tech applications affect people's lives in multiple domains, such as policing and medicine in the US. In each chapter, she presents stories of specific individuals, including herself, as they are caught up in different algorithmic systems. We witness their experience and hear their reflections as we consider the consequences of their design and implementation. So to start the conversation between these two books, we thought we'd give a nod to the title of this evening's event and invite each of you to take a few minutes to tell us what in your book is out of control, and also give us an example or a story from your book so that the readers get a flavor of your analysis.
And we could go alphabetically. No, we're going to go alphabetically. No. We're going to start with David's book, and we did sort of warn them they'd get a question where they should maybe take 5, at most 10 minutes, just to really, usually when we do book events, the authors will speak for 20 or 25 minutes. So we didn't want to deprive them of an opportunity to really give a sense of the arc of the book. So this prompt, what is out of control in your book, with the nod to algorithms out of control. David.
All right. I thought we could correct the eternal bias towards people with AA in their first name.
We'll do that in a later question.
Yeah. Okay. It might be tautological to say that meganets are out of control, since that's kind of the thesis of the book. But I'll start off by saying, why did I coin a new word? Why did we need a neologism? And what is a meganet? Well, the reason why I thought we needed a new word is that there's a fallacy, I think, that I've observed over the last couple decades since I worked at Microsoft and Google, and it was to really underestimate the human component of input into algorithms, into software. And there's a historical reason for that, because the way both computing technology and software evolved, it was building these discrete and static products that were then shipped out and foisted onto the populace. And people would complain about them, but fundamentally the engineers and the companies and the manufacturers of these products and algorithms maintain sort of a control over them. But with the advent of the internet, and especially with the advent of social media, that really ceased to be the case, and in a way that I think most people, even on the inside, didn't really realize, that once you start to have huge amounts of input of human data, user data being fed into these algorithms and shaping them constantly, so that, I'm been quoting Heraclitus a lot, that you aren't stepping into the same data stream twice. There's no guarantee that you're going to get the same thing out of Facebook or Google or any large computational system of sufficient size with sufficient numbers of users. And that's my definition of a meganet, that they're so dynamic, there's so much influx, and they're simply so fast and large and feedback driven that that they're much more out of control than we think. And I guess one of the things we can look back to is the financial crisis of 2008, where you saw high-frequency trading algorithms feeding back onto each other and basically losing that homeostasis and nearly tanking the world economy with it. Well, that's effectively what's happening in many, many more spheres. And you can see this. Well, one of the common examples was, I don't know if you know about the whole stonk phenomenon, where the GameStop stock was sent through the roof, not because of any change in fundamentals, but because a bunch of people on Reddit decided that they had some reason, and you can say whether it's sentimental attachment or whatever, but they organized spontaneously and caused the stock to shoot through the roof up by like 1,000% or something like this, and much to the vexation of institutional investors and the SEC, who are like, well, this seems like it should be illegal, but there's no actual collusion going on. And that form of spontaneous organization and feedback-driven effects on what I call these meganets is the sort of control we're looking at, and or the loss of control that we're looking at. That, in a way, control that used to be centralized has sort of devolved, so that each of us now has a tiny, non-determining amount of control over these systems, but taken together, that takes away the control from the people that we tend to think of. So that, to some extent, a lot of corporations like Facebook and even governments that administer identity services are not as in control of their products as we think. And the most recent example that I cite of this was Microsoft's Sydney AI that was released on the Bing search engine. And I don't know if you saw the New York Times article where they got it to say that it wanted to release the nuclear codes and things like that. But it was actually, the question is, why would Microsoft ever let something like this get out into the wild? It's not what you think of. And the issue is that they literally admitted that we're now all beta testers or alpha testers for this, because there's no way to test these things before you release them. So when I say what's out of control, I think it is our ability to understand, observe, and control algorithms in these kinds of systems to any great degree. And I think I've gone over, so I want Meredith to take over now. But,
well, David, that was fascinating. Thank you. Thank you, Natasha and Angela, for that fantastic introduction. And I'm delighted to be here with all of you tonight. So, David, you said a couple of things that I am excited to talk about. So I wrote them down, but I should start with explaining what glitch is about. So, more than a glitch, confronting race, gender, and ability bias in tech is about understanding the intersection of technology, race, gender, and disability. It came out of conversations that I had after the publication of my last book, Artificial Unintelligence. There's a chapter in there where I write about the history of artificial intelligence and how our ideas about the future of technology actually come from a small and homogeneous group of people, most of whom are Ivy League educated white male mathematicians. And, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Some of my best friends are Ivy League educated white male mathematicians. But it's a very closed vision, and there are lots of other visions for the future out there. So I found myself having a lot of conversations about the implications of this, and particularly having a lot of conversations around a concept that I also invented a neologism for that book, and the concept is called Technochauvinism. That's the idea that technological solutions are superior to others. And instead, I argue that we should think about what is the right tool for the task, and we should use that. Because sometimes the right tool for the task is a computer, and sometimes that's something simple like a book in the hands of a child sitting on its parent's lap. And one is not inherently better than the other, right? But where technochauvinism comes from is from an idea that David mentioned, the idea that that engineers have the power to create a thing and make the decisions about it, and that the socio-technical system is going to be flawless because it's invented by these brilliant engineers who are, who are better than other people, better at math, yes, but we can debate the whether the sense of superiority is earned or not, and so it's a very rigid and closed system, and that's not how the world works. And so when you have these rigid systems that are not taking into account the rich variety of human experience, you run into problems. You also discover that automated systems discriminate by default. So this idea of discrimination by default was really powerful for me. It was one that I came across in Ruha Benjamin's excellent book, Race After Technology. Dr. Benjamin's book was really influential for me in writing this. Safia Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression, was also really influential for me. And another thing that I do, in addition to kind of bringing these scholarly works in conversation, is I bring them in conversation with excellent journalism that's been done over the past several years, uncovering bias in technology and investigating algorithms. I do this as a data journalist, as a practicing data journalist, and I specialize in a kind of journalism called algorithmic accountability reporting, which is a field that came about because algorithms are increasingly being used to make decisions on our behalf. And so the traditional accountability function of the press has to then transfer onto algorithms and their makers. So a couple of the stories that I tell in the book have to do with algorithms out of control. One that I think is relevant is a story that was reported out of Florida, out of Pasco County, where the sheriff's office came up with a new program that was a kind of predictive policing system. Predictive policing, maybe you're familiar with it from The Wire. Remember on the season of The Wire where they had ComStat? ComStat, of course, is possibly the most famous predictive policing system, the idea being that you take the data about where crime has happened and you feed into the system, and then it makes a model that shows the mathematical patterns in the data, and then you can use it to predict where crime will happen in the future. Of course, there are major problems with this, starting with the fact that crime data doesn't show crimes, it shows arrests, right? Which are crimes and arrests are very different things. Certain neighborhoods are over-policed. Those tend to be the poor neighborhoods, the neighborhoods that are mostly black and brown neighborhoods. So you get this dangerous feedback loop where the systems are being fed with data about crimes that happened in certain places, and then the systems are asked to predict where the crime is happening, and then they predict that more crime is going to happen there, so then more police resources get deployed there to an already over-policed and over-surveilled community, and it's just a disaster. So precision policing, or predictive policing, it's bad news. Then after that era, we moved into the era of precision policing and looking at individuals who police decided were going to be future criminals or were at risk of being future criminals. So the Pasco County Sheriff's Office came up with this program where they decided they were going to use public data and actually private data as well, and they were going to build a system that would identify citizens who they thought were going to be criminals in the future, and then they would deploy police in order to kind of get on top of the issue, which basically meant harassing people and issuing tickets for things like, your grass is 1 centimeter too long, right? Which, yes, is like against against the law technically, but honestly, who gives a ticket for your grass being a centimeter too long? And it was targeted harassment against citizens who were identified by the system. Eventually, they got really excited about what they saw as the success of this system and decided to deploy it on kids. So they took student data from the local school and fed this into the system and identified kids who they thought were going to be future criminals. And for this, they used things like attendance data or grades. And eventually, some amazing reporters discovered what was going on, tracked down not just the data that was being used to feed the system, but also the fact that students' educational data, which is protected under FERPA, was being used inside these systems, blew the lid off the situation, and the sheriff got in big trouble, and thank goodness this system is not being used anymore. But it's a good example of how these types of systems discriminate by default, because if you had to guess who were the citizens who were targeted by these systems, you might guess that they were black and brown folks, that they were poorer folks, and you would be correct, right? The wealthy whiter residents of the county were not the ones identified by the systems, right? So I tell a lot of stories like this, and they are about algorithms out of control.
Thank you, Meredith. So for the next question, it's a follow-up on this question of control. We noted that both of you use the terms feedback loops to illustrate how things are going wrong in the technology that you are writing about, which again is often at very different levels and scales, right? In David's account, here I'm quoting here, Meganets are highly feedback driven. They enable, quote, lightning fast runaway interactions of people and algorithms and lead to uncontrollable complexity, and a kind of complexity that's prone to unstable, unfamiliar, unpredictable phenomenon. It sort of has this hazy future, you don't know where it's going. And this exponential growth of Meganets gives them this very risky, entropic quality. It's sort of off the rails. In Meredith's account, tech bias or tech discrimination, if we want to use Ruha Benjamin's term that also appears in the book, I noticed you used words like tech bias is described in terms of an exacerbation, a perpetuation, or a compounding of inequality, which also suggests a kind of amplificatory pattern that could be described as a runaway feedback loop. In fact, I think you even cite an article, a pretty well-known article, I can't remember the names of the author, but it's called Runaway Feedback Loops in Predictive Policing, which you just told us about. And yet, putting these two kinds of feedback loops together, the harms that are showing up in the computer systems and software that you're describing are not unfamiliar, unpredictable, but rather they're replicating. They may have that too, but your emphasis is on how they're replicating or reproducing these older, regrettably familiar structural inequalities. So we wanted to give you each a chance to sort of tell us, again, an example. Both these books, I learned so much, not only about how to think about these things, but in terms of cases. There's just like so many stories I want to tell people on so many levels. I'm being asked to sit closer to my mic. So yeah, give us an example of the specific feedback loops at stake in your analysis and how problems emerge from them. You could go in any order, but David, let's start with you.
Yeah, actually, Meredith gave so much to respond to that I would love, because in some ways, listening to you makes me feel that we are very much on the same page.
Oh, yeah,
that
very
you
much.
have these appalling stories, and they are, I think, reflections of some of the same sorts of phenomena I was treating. One of the ones that popped into my mind is Amazon attempted to implement a machine learning driven resume screener in order to identify, okay, well, can we filter out resumes that fall below a certain bar? And what happened was exactly what Meredith is describing here, where effectively being female put you at a disadvantage. Female resumes got filtered out at a greater, independent of any other factor. Being female was enough to knock the weights down to make your resume less likely. So, and you can see that if you were to, say, not check that system, that would indeed start to replicate and build on itself. So to that extent, I guess I'm citing that example to say that perhaps we're starting from a different vantage point, but some of the outcomes are actually very similar in terms of what we see. I guess where I want to call attention is that I do think that these phenomena are multiplying in speed, and so I worry that our ability to check these systems is actually going down because if we go into it assuming that these algorithms do replicate biases, which I think. I don't know. I feel like we're I don't know if we can debate that because I think we're in agreement.
Yeah. I mean, it's true. It doesn't need to be debated.
If we then say that, well, for every example that we may catch, and for something like recidivism algorithms or predictive policing, you can drill down. Or I think they did an analysis, I think, of the broken windows policing, that they were able to drill down and show that the people of color were being stopped, independent of any other factor, more often than whites. That if an audit takes that much time, what does one do if we go in with the assumption that these systems are just multiplying in size and speed? How are we going to catch all of this? And I have some possible explorations, but it was something that I wanted to ask Meredith because it's something that very much worries me in that one of the main themes of my book is that this is happening at increasing speed, and so these feedback effects are growing. And I can't speak for Meredith, but certainly for me, it came very much out of a cybernetic background in the study of systems from sort of functional and ecological perspective, and seeing that there wasn't, because of the way these systems have arisen, we don't know what homeostasis looks like for them, and we don't necessarily know that they're going to reach homeostasis, much less that homeostasis is going to be anything that we particularly want. So, given that we can't just throw the systems out, the question that I guess I would like to have hovering, and I'm not going to answer now, is what do we do if we make that assumption? How do we keep up with the fact that that sort of inequality, reification is growing in spite of our best efforts?
Yeah,
the
I'll
contrary.
I think it would be useful for the audience to know that a very successful repeating theme in your book, David, has to do with the 3 V's. You don't call it the 3 V's, but it's volume, velocity, and virality, that these are sort of qualities of what you're calling Meganets that sort of take on their own state changing, out of control properties.
And virality is basically feedback. I just needed a word that started with V. Yeah, so,
Feedback.
yeah.
So I want to come back to the idea of what is valued in the world and what is valued in these systems, because I don't really value virality anymore. I'm not sure I ever did, but I just simply don't. So I wrote so many notes. I think I want to start with the Amazon resume system. So to me, I have a really different read on that Amazon project because when David, when you belong to the Society of Engineers, like your resume says internet, says IEEE, right? And when I belong to the Society of Engineers, I belong to the National Society of Black Engineers, right? So the fact that the resume sorting algorithm was a machine learning system that was trained on resumes and then was trained to select resumes that were like those of the people who succeeded at Amazon already. The people making that algorithm were folks who belonged to IEEE and who would say things like, oh, well, you know, we can anonymize resumes by taking the names off of them, right? But because I have always played women's sports and because I have always belonged to organizations like, you know, the National Society of Black Engineers, I know that signifiers of race and gender are always encoded in the name of the things that I do, right? When you play basketball, when you're a man, you're in the National Basketball Association. When you play basketball and you're a woman, you're in the Women's National Basketball Association. So unless you have, like, that's not something that occurs to you unless you are a person who, you know, who belongs to an organization that has, you know, some kind of race or gender signifier in the name. So I'm very keenly aware that it is impossible to strip out identifiers of race and gender from a resume, but that is not obvious to everybody, right? And it's especially not obvious to the kind of small and homogeneous group of people making that particular Amazon technology. So I try in my work to be really attuned to unconscious bias. We all have unconscious bias. We're all trying to become better people every day, but we have it. And an inescapable fact is that people embed their own unconscious bias in the technology that they create. And because it's unconscious, you can't see it, right? You don't know you're doing it. And so that just happens. So a very easy way to address it would be to have more diverse teams of people creating our technologies. That has not happened, not because it's not possible, but because there has never been the will in Silicon Valley to make it happen. And so it's actually never a surprise to me that that algorithmic systems discriminate. I think maybe I was surprised 20 years ago, but now I'm never surprised. And one of the things that algorithmic accountability reporters do is every time there is a new system, like right now it's ChatGPT, and everybody's like, oh, there are so many wonderful possibilities. And I could give you like a very long list of what are the likely problems that people are going to run into in terms of, you know, ChatGPT malfunctioning along lines of bias, having to do with race and gender, disability, a million other things. And yes, all of those things have happened, right? So I think I see these systems as less unpredictable. I think that they are actually really predictable based on what are the social problems in the world, because they're socio-technical systems. I also want to talk about what feels familiar versus what is surprising. I think that we do treat things like, when ChatGPT starts spewing racist language, we treat it as a surprise. We're like, oh my gosh, I'm so surprised that happened. But no, like, it's a very familiar phenomenon. So I think we need to think differently about what's going to happen in these systems. And in terms of control, one of the things that I do in my own kind of social media and search situation is I make my social media feed and my search feed really boring. right? Because the novelty seeking is one of the things that makes the algorithm or makes the recommendation algorithms get out of control. And so my own way of managing it is I create the illusion of control by locking everything down and making it really boring. And, yes, I'm not seeing like the weirdo, I'm not seeing the weirdo stuff, but, I'm seeing pictures of cute puppies and people's like kids' prom pictures, and it's very sedate and it's kind of nice.
Thank you both. Any follow-ups either? No?
I guess it's interesting. I think about machine learning as being one of the, by which we mean the form of artificial intelligence that informs ChatGPT and is also going to inform, it involves image recognition, which, as you know, has had huge problems in terms of identifying different types of minority faces, for example. And the accepted minimum for a good, I think, training set is something like 15 million examples. And I guess from my perspective, I think of it as, well, you can't curate that on a case-by-case basis. And one of the things that I wonder about is, well, what would it look like to engage in a corrective sort of curation for a sort of training set, especially when there's no transparency about these things. I mean, even if you were to get what might be perceived as a diverse or trustworthy team, would you then be able to say, okay, we now know that the training data is not going to yield unpredictable results, when it seems that, again, Microsoft was producing, Sydney was producing pretty unpredictable results to begin with, and that the degree of possibilities is such that they're, now admitting, okay, yeah, we're now going to be testing this stuff out in the wild. And you can get sort of an iterative process where you now have the entire population, giving feedback into it. But that, in some ways, I feel blows up the issue even more, because now how are you taking into account the feedback of the tens and hundreds of millions of people using this and incorporating it in a fair way to improve, to shunt this in the right direction?
Well, I mean, maybe it's foolish to try and use the system at all. Mm-hmm. Like, maybe it's a foolish way to try and govern the world.
Yeah, we're going to come back to some of these sort of measures, and because you both offer a refreshingly precise and robust set of recommendations. So Angela.
Yeah.
Next.
So for now, we move to a question that's related to control, but also it's about perceptions, popular perceptions. So both Meredith and David address the popular assumption or myth that technology works or can be made to work as its designers intended to. And there are confirming echoes across the two books in this regard. They also offer distinct complementary angles. So in her book, Meredith provides close-up analysis of why institutions jump to adopt technologies, such as policing, surveillance tools, or school software, even after seeing evidence of its tech failures. And Meredith homes in on the concept technochauvinism, and Meredith introduced it to us already in the opening remark. So we found this concept very useful to think about the prevalent tendency in our society. So we'd like to invite Meredith to tell us a bit more about this concept. What are the signs and how to identify its operations in our society? And then, whereas Meredith focuses on how, I quote, AI doesn't work as well as people imagined. So David makes a further point that big tech's control over AI doesn't work as well as people imagine. So in other words, he highlights that once the tech product becomes part of a meganet, its creator has decreasing capacity to manage it. And I also like the examples, David, you give in the book about how cryptocurrency functions really not as intended, and also how it forms part of the world economy in this kind of very large scale fluctuating and sometimes like unintended behavior. So he has one more memorable line in his book. So he said, in fact, today, I quote, "The battle is the elites versus the networks that they have themselves birthed," end quote. So David, could you also elaborate on this understanding and how it challenges the popular perception about AI and tech?
Yeah. Well, it gets back, I guess, to what I was saying at the start, that it's because these systems made their way into our lives and are so incredibly visible in a way that, in a way that, say, J.P. Morgan has become less visible. Goldman Sachs and Chase all have tremendous influence on our lives, and yet we don't talk about them anywhere near the extent we talk about Facebook or Twitter. In the scheme of things, Twitter is a comparatively small company, and yet the amount of ink spent on one eccentric billionaire's dance with it, has dwarfs that which you might spend on, okay, well, what is going on in the derivatives market, and part of that is the novelty factor, but part of it also is that I think that without necessarily intending to, you had effectively, you had sort of a boy king syndrome, and I think that boy king is definitely the term to use about it. I think of Sam Bankman-Fried is one of the latest poster children, but I think he only represents one degenerate case where Sam Bankman-Fried carried all the cards of the elite, and I think one of the reasons why he got to the point where he did was that even though this was some offshore crypto, dodgy crypto scheme, he still came from the right origin. And in the absence of sort of the old school elite networks that were, that happened behind closed doors, it's now sort of what you see, what the signifiers that are attached to you that count for a lot. So that's what allows Sam Bankman-Fried. And I think that in that same way, companies like Google and Facebook, because they suddenly represented this incredible increase in market capitalization and an explosion of the economy, they attracted the attention of, okay, well, they are suddenly more, they have a more determinant factor on our world than Goldman Sachs, for example. Pardon me. And they were very happy to take on that role of being, our new overlords and whatever. And the intersection with a certain sort of libertarian rationalism did not help that at all. I saw that on the Chat GPT front, they're printing Eliezer Yudkowsky in was it in Time or, but I don't know. At any rate, he represents a sort of actually, well, you can speak about Eliezer.
Oh no, you can feel free.
I
don't actually talk about that sector.
Well, I think the thing is that there was a very, very hermetic, almost rationalist arrogance of the sort that people caricature Descartes and Francis Bacon, but this is considerably more. I think, that you have people who literally think that some sort of utilitarian calculus can be put together and applied to the entire world, and a lot of tech leaders use this rhetoric very loudly. and many of them drunk their own Kool-Aid. And so that when the inevitable happened and people started getting annoyed with these technologies corrupting our lives, and that the tech companies realized that, oh, they weren't so above it all either. There was a recurrent theme where the companies would say, oh, we just can't win. And they wanted to sort of push responsibility onto the fact that, okay, well, society is rotten, and if society were just better, we wouldn't annoy people so much. No, that's not true. But there's a story I tell in the book, which is that when Facebook was dealing with, I think, a Swedish far right, like neo-Nazi propaganda that they were pushing, not pushing, but that was getting negative attention because Facebook wasn't censoring it. There was an executive memo that was leaked that did not say, okay, let's say why this isn't our fault, but it said limit the meme that we aren't in control of our own systems. Because I genuinely believe that there's not even an economic incentive to letting that sort of stuff through. It's just too marginal and attracts far more negative attention than positive attention. And even now, you can go on Facebook today and find all sorts of stuff that, without looking too hard, that is fairly noxious and does not seem to have, and it seems to be far enough along the long tail that you'd say, well, why couldn't they just get rid of it? Well, I think that they don't want to admit that even with an army of moderators that are being traumatized every day by having to look at this stuff, they're still playing catch up. And I mean, the parallel I drew was to China, where they have an army of people monitoring social media, but it's hardly that China manages to run a tight ship. There is still dissent is still being expressed, despite China not even paying lip service to the idea of sort of liberal discourse. So the long way around of that is that I think these companies were happy to grab onto the idea of having power because they were convinced of both of their power and the munificence, and now they're sort of in the hot seat and are trying to, I guess, square the circle of maintaining control while quietly saying it's not our responsibility. And this was actually on display a few months ago at the Supreme Court, when there was Google had to get up because on something relating to the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, where the Supreme Court justices were saying, in effect, that, well, it sure doesn't look like you're a neutral arbiter. Look at how much you aren't just a neutral carrier. You aren't just carrying stuff through. You're actually moderating content, cutting stuff out. And Google was saying, okay, but you can't make us responsible for everything that goes through. Why, there's just too much. And the justices actually seemed perplexed by this, and they said, yeah, I guess you're right. What are we going to do? And that's not to say that these companies don't bear responsibility for it, and it does not to say that they don't, that they shouldn't be a lot more honest. But it is to say that I think the companies would be happy to have that level of control if they could achieve it, even if that wouldn't be a good thing for society. But all indications are that they actually do lack that level of fine-grained control, and my thesis is that it is literally impossible for them to have that level of fine-grained control.
Meredith? Yeah, I think I agree completely. It is impossible for algorithms to have that degree of control, because algorithms are ultimately just math. Like, what Facebook is doing is it's doing math on sentences and on images. The sentences are not understood as sentences by the computer the same way that they're understood by humans. To a computer, a sentence is just a collection of text. It's just a string. It's a bunch of characters. Even spaces are not actually spaces. They're just they're just represented by ones and zeros. So it is literally impossible to create algorithms that govern the social sphere. And yet, there was this fantasy starting in 1956 at the founding of artificial intelligence that it would be possible to do this in the future. And people made an awful lot of money off of that fantasy. And I think that's part of the reason that nobody's willing to call it, right? Like, I think that's one of the reasons we're so stuck, is because this vision of this sleek technological future, this like Jetsons kind of situation, really still has a stranglehold on our collective imaginations. One of the things I think we can do to break out of that particular situation is to think about different visions of the future. There are indigenous futures to think about. There's Chicano futurism, there's Afrofuturism. There are lots of kinds of potential futures that we could be looking to that are not just about the kind of California techno-libertarian whole earth catalog, new communalist ideology, and that particular vision of the future, right? So I would also point everyone's attention to Lena Khan, who is running the FTC. Lena Khan has an editorial in the New York Times today that is basically a call to arms, saying, listen, tech companies, regulation is coming. I believe that the title I saw was, we need to regulate AI, and here's how. Not that titles are ever connected to the stories. So fun fact, as a journalist, I have only ever written 2 titles in my whole entire multi-decade career, because journalists never write the headlines that go with their stories. We always get accused of things based on the headlines. But no, the copy editors and the editors write the headlines. And they do this thing called A/B testing, where in the content management system, they write in 2 different headlines. A/B testing actually comes from tech. And the idea is you roll out version A and version B, and you test them to see which one works better, and then you change it to the version that works better, right? So journalists never write their own headlines. That is a total digression. I just think everybody should know it.
And then we get to sound like idiots when we say on Twitter, we didn't write that.
Yeah. Yeah, we get a lot of grief about the headlines. So we are mostly responsible for the content that runs under our names, though. And so Lena Khan's editorial is about here's how AI regulation should work. The FTC put out a strongly worded letter or strongly worded guidance recently saying there is no exemption for tech firms, right? Because for a very long time, tech firms have been operating under the assumption that cyberspace is different than IRL, that somehow cyberspace is different than real life, and that they could get away with things in cyberspace that would be prohibited in real life. This comes directly from the new communalist ideology of the whole earth folks who in the 1960s were counterculture folks who were living on communes. Then the communes fell apart, and they didn't really have anywhere to go, but they discovered this new world of cyberspace, and so the failed commune ideas got implemented in cyberspace. Fred Turner's book about the whole earth catalog is really the canonical account of how this happened. And so that's why we, for example, don't have geographic territories on the internet. And you do have, you don't have country lines on the internet except when you do, Right. So a good example of this is the fact that you can't stream from your Hulu account when you go to Europe, which I discovered when I went to Europe and I tried to like watch my, I don't know, whatever series I was watching. And I realized I had to use a VPN if I wanted to be able to watch my trashy television show. So in the popular imagination, there aren't country lawns on the internet, but practically speaking, like, yes, commerce globally has to be regulated, and so that regulation does exist to a certain extent. So at any rate, check out Lena Khan's editorial. I am pretty enthusiastic about the philosophy that says we don't need necessarily new regulation for tech. We need to implement existing regulation, existing laws in tech spheres. Amazon, for example, didn't pay sales tax for its first many, many years of existence because Jeff Bezos simply didn't want to, right? He thought, all right, well, I am operating a web business and nobody knows where a web business should be located, so I'm not going to charge sales tax and I'm not going to pay sales tax. And then if we look at Jeff Bezos's current tax returns, like, he's still not paying taxes. Like, it's kind of a problem, I think. So, yeah, technochauvinism, it's a problem.
I'm glad you brought up that editorial, because our next, and I think is this pretty much our last big question is, we've called it, what should be done? Because both of you do offer solutions, right? Toward the end of your text, David, you say, we have no choice but to take the bad with the good, and so the bad requires intense attention in the hopes of mitigating it as best we can, and then you proceed to suggest a range of methods that might attend how you would regulate something like a meganet, right? And then Meredith, I love toward the end of your text, you say, oh reader, like the book is not entirely a bummer. So I was like, okay.
Because it did get to be a bummer after a little while.
I mean, both
I could
books
see that.
had moments of extreme bummerness. But we thought we'd end on the, if not optimistic, then at least not totally pessimistic recommendations that each of you offers regarding what might be done around the problems of tech that you have identified and explored, which I do think are, I think in these last questions, what's really come to the floor is what Angela and I meant by supplementary. I feel like you both are acknowledging techno-chauvinism, and Meredith, you're focusing sort of at the level of inputs to these systems, and then David is concerning himself more with what happens after the inputs, right? When they're sort of off and jump the fence and are in the wild, then maybe you have to look at other processes and think about how you might try to ameliorate those. So, Meredith, we appreciated that you're walking this nuanced line in your recommendations of, as you alluded to earlier in a comment, banning outright some tech, right? Just saying that the solution here is just to ban it, to not use it, to throw it away. And then in other cases, making the call that, okay, we should work to ameliorate bias in these other domains. And you lay out a number of ideas in a chapter that's called Creating Public Interest Technology. So we're going to ask you to share, just as your closing before we open to questions, what are some of those, or an idea you're most excited about in creating public interest technology? What does that mean? So David, again, at a different scale or a different moment of intervention, I'd say, you're offering, and I'm quoting here, proactive, systemic, and non-specific measures to temper meganets. So instead of focusing on the sort of surgical targeting of specific content or applications, you're basically arguing that the meganet demands a different kind of intervention. And the interventions you're suggesting are a whole set of sort of what I see in cybernetic terms as thermostatic measures that slow down the runaway growth, dampen, I think you used the phrase lower the temperature. So we would invite you, after Meredith shares some of her interventions into her unit of analysis, right? With your unit of analysis being the Meganet, what are some examples of these tempering measures? So Meredith.
Well, thank you for that. And I really like this distinction between the small units that I'm writing about and the mega units, or the meganets that David's writing about. David, one of the things that I really admire about your book is that you take on these big sprawling networks, because I tried. I mean, I definitely had a chapter about this is how social media works, and I was like, oh no, this is just like way too sprawling. Like, I cannot handle this in 20 pages. So it is a big project. It does take a whole book. So I really admire tackling that complexity. To me, nuclear is actually a really good metaphor. One of the things that I discovered doing research for the last book was that a lot of the folks who worked on the Manhattan Project then went into computer science, right? Because computer science developed as a field right after World War II. A lot of them were hanging out around Princeton, around the Institute for Advanced Study, which is one of the places that I started writing the last book. And so nuclear provides a really good template. There are some things that we cannot do with nuclear energy. Like we have just said, all right, like you may not make nuclear bombs. And it's been okay, right? It hasn't worked perfectly, but the world is a little bit safer. But there are some places you can use nuclear energy, and maybe there's other applications for it. So I think that when people start thinking about, oh my God, we can never regulate tech, like of course we could regulate tech. And what if we looked at it like we think about nuclear energy? Well, we didn't think we could regulate that either, but guess what? We did. And we also regulated telecom in the, in all of the different eras that we regulated telecom. AT&T, for example, was a telecom monopoly and then got broken up, right? And the world did not end. So to go back to public interest technology is just what it sounds like. It's about creating technology in the public interest. This is a relatively new field. It is being created as we speak, and it came out of a similar initiative that took place in the 1960s when folks realized that lawyers coming out of law school were going into practice and were ending up in these big law firms and weren't going to work for the government and weren't going to work for for the public good. And so they created a field called public interest law, right, which is about lawyers, operating in the public interest. It was very successful or moderately successful, and so public interest technology came out of a similar response, specifically after Obama's first win, which was, I think, the most tech-enabled presidential race up until that point. And then after the second race, this thing happened as well. Ordinarily, folks would work on the campaign and then go into the administration. But what happened was folks worked on this very tech-enabled campaign, and then they went to work in Silicon Valley. And then it happened again in Obama's second election. And people realized that, oh, wait, there's this enormous brain drain. And our next generation of public servants are just not going to exist if people are not going into government work. This also has implications for our next generation of government technologists, right? Because if salaries, for example, if government salary bands are not keeping up with the outsized salaries that people can command in Silicon Valley, then we are not going to have people working in US government who know how to operate our technologies. And this also is tied to, obviously, the way that government has been a little bit slow to keep up, technologically speaking. Now, I am pleased to say that I've talked to a lot of folks in Washington over the past couple of years, and people are catching up, right? So it's really great. And now we have public interest technology, which is on the university side about helping students who are interested in public service and also interested in technology to find jobs so that we have people who can rebuild websites, who can strengthen government websites so that when there's the next pandemic and millions of people are applying for unemployment benefits at exactly the same time, the employment benefit websites will not go down, right? We also have public interest technologists who are training to be algorithmic accountability reporters. Because as I said before, one of the functions of the press is to hold power accountable, and we need to do that in the algorithmic world as well. So public interest technology is one of the things I'm really excited about. Algorithmic auditing, which you can feel free to ask me about afterward, is the other super nerdy thing that I'm excited about. And I think we're going to see a lot more about algorithmic auditing in the coming years.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, thank you for all of that, Meredith, and thank you, Angela and Natasha. And everybody should read Natasha's book as well, even if it's Addicted by Design, since it was actually a significant influence on my book. It's about slot machines and conditioning people to behave in addicted ways, and that was carried over right into Meganets. And if anybody remembers Farmville, it's basically the same thing. So yeah, thank you for providing this great context. I guess I'll start off with a different example than one I've cited so far, which is India's national identification service, which is called Aadhaar. In India right now, you have a pretty much citizens. It is officially voluntary, but if you want to get a phone or open a bank account, you have to have a single identifying number that identifies you, that is issued by the government, and so it's basically it's your driver's license, it's your social security number, it's your the taxpayer ID, it's everything all in one. And all government services are centralized this, but increasingly also a large amount of non-government services. And the program seems to have been sincerely implemented with the idea of that sort of public interest in mind, but it has had, let's say, unintended side effects. In fact, one of the problems has been in that in attempting to reduce the amount of private information exposure, Aadhaar has actually made it easier for whole-scale total identity theft to take place. When we think of identity theft today, it's usually, okay, well, one identifier, like a credit card number or whatever, is stolen. Well, once you unify all those systems, which I believe Meganets and our modern network society encourage people to do, because you get this increasing amount of redundancy and chaos, so why wouldn't you centralize it? So other countries are starting to move in this direction as well, and I do believe the United States will eventually get there, that you start to get all these interconnected systems of public and private pushing on each other and leading to unintended effects that suddenly, your cell phone company may know that you receive HIV benefits, for example. At the scale we're talking about, these leakages happen, at a rate that I think is scary, because even if they don't happen that often, they happen on such a scale that they can cause catastrophe. If you were to say leak, tens of thousands or millions of ADHAR numbers, you've now, this is more than just credit card numbers or passwords for a particular site leaking. And so that's why the solutions that I gravitated towards revolved around, I guess, trying to avoid the problem of trying to shut the door after the horse is bolted or playing whack-a-mole, because it seemed that we would forever be playing catch-up if we tried to address issues in an individual way, which is not to say that you can't do that in particularly mission-critical cases. We do seem to do a good job of keeping child pornography off of the internet. But at the point where you're dealing with phenomena that happen on larger scales than that, or even worse, phenomena that happen unintentionally just through network effects and the sort of feedback effects I'm talking about, it's not good enough to sort of do it through whatever old-fashioned police work or whatever you want to call it. But instead, I think you actually want to operate on the network itself. And a couple ideas, some of them that I give at the end, some of them are just slowing things down. Basically, do not have some sort of informational sluice that's administered in a fair or turn-taking way that prevents quite so much data from feeding back onto itself at the rate that we see now, where you can have a viral explosion of possibly something very ugly before anyone's had a chance to intervene and say, no, that's not actually the case. But you can go beyond that and say, okay, well, we already have these tremendous amounts of data flowing around. Facebook, even if you've never, ever signed on to Facebook or created a Facebook account, Facebook likely has a profile on you just in case you sign up one day, and then they can unify it with the data they've collected from everywhere else. If you were to go about and actually start to poison those data stores, basically start injecting wrong data, and there was a book a few years ago that suggested doing this on an individual level, and unfortunately I forget
Helen
that.
Nissenbaum and Finn Brunton, former colleagues of ours in MCC, wrote a book called Obfuscation about the kind of ways that you can create noise in your own data stream, which I think Meredith is doing in a way by locking down her stream. You're dampening these kind of effects, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you, Natasha. You're like a search engine right here. I can use, yeah. Right, yeah. And so they suggested on an individual level. My sense is that you actually need to go further than that, and that you can't hoping for people to do it on a voluntary basis. Like, I always give a different birthday whenever I sign into anything, which makes recovering passwords a nightmare. But okay, so I protected myself. What have I done for the world? Not much. But if you could have some sort of NGO or some sort of coordinated, sanctioned organization actually inject false data in and launder it, which is very easy to do, such that it seems just as authentic as anything else, you would actually have you could have a gradual loss of confidence in this data. And, this already happens and we don't care about it. Facebook claimed that I was black for 5 years, and I didn't have any interest in correcting that. But if you could get to the point where the companies actually start to suffer from increasing and multiplying numbers of errors, you could actually get to the point where maybe they would actually have to ask people to consent to sharing their data, and where they would actually have to say, okay, I don't trust this. And in some realms, this is already the case. If you look at the sharing of medical data, that's something that's always been locked down. And so medical data doesn't quite leak at the rate that most data does. It still does. There's stories of like, well, if you look on Amazon for baby products, all of a sudden, then there was a teenage girl who got advertisements in the mail for pregnancy care products, and her parents freaked out because she hadn't told them. So you still do have that leakage of medical data, but it is possible to set up regulations. The problem with something like the medical examples, that doesn't quite scale. So that's why I say is that sort of operating in a non-targeted way and proactively trying to mess up the data. This is I guess my sense of a compromise towards what you're saying, that if the financial and corporate incentive remains there for these systems to keep blowing up and they keep pulling in more money and whatever than some of these other futures that you're talking about, how can we at least dampen their impact until perhaps something more radical comes about? Those are a couple examples. I get into more in the book, but that's sort of what I thought was the most realistic approach, was to basically say, well, we can't hope for people to take control of their own data, because there's even knowing what data about you exists out there is already too great a task. And fortunately, I do think it's becoming increasingly mandatory that, I like that you said that, that the cyber world was not the real world, but which is not to say that there aren't forces that are pushing them to become identical as fast as possible. And I think that what we have to do is make it so that as that role, because that's basically what the metaverse is to try to say that, okay, well, let's have for the sake of trillions of dollars in revenue, let's try to computationalize and gamify as much of our lives as possible. And I think without some sort of proactive intervention, that we are indeed headed towards that world. And I think that sort of proactive intervention can come about when it comes to things like deep fakes as well. That one of the biggest things in AI, one of the things that AI really is going to do, is I think going to make manufacturing made-up content that seems convincingly real incredibly easy. And this is, I guess, where I do draw a distinction between it and, say, nuclear energy or even cloning, which is that requires certain material that is still effectively scarce. Whereas, thanks to the explosion in processing power and Moore's law, any given technology, you can now run Deep Blue on a smartphone, and that is one of those things that I think makes regulation exceptionally difficult. That the promiscuity of this technology and the spreading of it is very, very hard to prevent. And I think we found this out with encryption. They were trying to ban encryption exports, and it just never really got off the ground because, well, if you need, if you need enriched uranium, okay, that's good. But if all you need is, is the latest and greatest in technology, that is the same thing with cryptocurrency mining. I mean, China does seem to have actually cracked down on it, but that's the sort of level of government intervention you need just to crack down on even like cryptocurrency mining. And it also was an effect that in there you actually were running out of material because they were running low on the sort of graphics GPUs and such that was required to actually execute these things. So that's why I feel like the more proactive methods are required, and I do think there's some experimentation required to see what would actually work the best. But I think we can cope with it. But and I am really happy that these questions are being brought up at least, and that everybody is thinking about them. And thank you everybody for hosting this.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Meredith. To wrap up, so one value to these supplementary accounts is that they chip away at the idea that digital tech is a monolith. Instead, it involves a wide range of actors, including tools, machines, designers, a variety of institutional dynamics and economics, which also demand different explorations and remedies. So I think at this point, we're open to audience questions.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'd appreciate your help in explaining. First of all, is there anybody that you know that's addressing this paradox that despite the chauvinistic boasts, despite the chauvinistic boasts of the purported superiority of the tech and engineers and all these people, the universities with their alleged superior IT departments are paying out billions and billions of dollars because they can't figure out how to not be outsmarted by these remote people who just hack them all over the place. And nobody has completely estimated the total amount that was paid out in to ransom their stuff. So it's underestimated, the billions that have been paid out. So I'd like your help in understanding this paradox.
Great, thank you for that. I would say that fraud and cybercrime are really pretty serious problems. Josephine Wolf has written this really interesting book about cyber insurance. So companies now buy insurance to protect themselves against things like hacking scandals, which is super interesting. And there's another thing that I was thinking of, David, as you were talking. There's a really fun project that you can do to look at your own digital footprint, and that involves getting your Amazon data, right? So all of the tech companies, as a nod toward transparency and the illusion of user control, have made a mechanism so that you can get your archive, right? So you can download your Twitter archive, you can download your Facebook archive, you can download your Amazon data, and they're not going to give you everything. So David mentioned that Facebook has a profile on you. Your shadow profile that Facebook has, they're not going to give you that, but they will give you a file with every Facebook post you've ever made. Amazon will give you a file with every purchase you've ever made, every piece of music you've ever streamed, every movie you've ever watched, and also everything you've ever said to an Alexa, right? So I had an Alexa for like 2 weeks. So I was doing a project with a class where we were building voice apps for news to experiment with, does this make any sense? And it was fun. And so I had the Alexa at home for like 2 weeks, and I built some apps for it, and it was great. But one of the funny things was that I taught my kid how to use it, and he got a big kick out of it. And then I discovered from my archive that my kid was talking to the Alexa when I wasn't there. And so I could see all of the things that he had been talking to the Alexa about, which were mostly things like, Alexa, do you know who Dragon Ball Z is? And it was really cute.
But you didn't answer my question. The question is, why are these purportedly superior entities being outsmarted by these remote people in the jungle? Why are they being able to continuously hack? And the FBI is overwhelmed. They can't even deal with all the scamming that's going on. So nobody can explain that.
Well, I think, David, your book sort of points in that direction.
There's
right?
also a classic line from the IRA to Margaret Thatcher. I think they said, you have to be lucky all the time. We only have to be lucky once.
So let's just get some more questions. Martin.
By the way, let me also endorse Josephine Wolf's book. It's fantastic, and she's great.
Yeah, she's amazing.
Hi. So I'm curious about the way you both landed on solutions, which were both sort of non-legal solutions, though along the way you were saying that the law could just do things, monopoly, AT&T, blah blah blah. But I wonder, when I heard the actual examples of that were used, first the one you mentioned, David, about the chaos, and of high frequency trading and so on and so forth, that was equally, perhaps more systemically describable through the erosion of underwriting laws over, when it came to like the housing market. Now you could take a mortgage earlier and so on. And these were like incremental changes that were made in the law.
Yeah.
Or securitization or collateralized debt obligations. These are not, so it's not strictly the digital, but somehow an erosion of certain kinds of laws. So that's the first example. The other example was 230, where you sort of, I think a little bit sort of redundantly said, well, you know, Google is like, we're not a neutral carrier of information. We understand the safe harbor passage and we freak out about that. However, that law is caught between a Scylla and a Charybdis, that moderation too is permitted without being punished. Remember, before that law, we have Prodigy versus AOL that creates the law. So it's caught in this weird rock and a hard place. And that's partly why we have these problems. And I'm surprised that we didn't go back to the structure. If we're looking for systemic things, why these aren't just old-fashioned questions of the law, and why it's so much about the digital and so on.
Well, I mean, that's a great point. And I think the issue is that it's slipping out of, because of the, from my perspective, it's because of the size, it's slipping out of control, direct control of the law. That for the sorts of targeted interventions, it's good. But if you look at sort of the cycle of cryptocurrency, that's one of the alarms that I raise in the book, is that the sorts of preventions and fixes that were used in 2008 are not going to be as possible with cryptocurrency, because partly because of its own design. But even let's say theoretically, and I actually think cryptocurrency is moving towards a more institutionally controlled paradigm after the sort of flush out of last year. But be that as it may, in this. In the same way that you know, Google's now sort of giving it a shrug, you know, if you could imagine, say, okay, well, let's imagine that Google is now distributed, the responsibility for Google now no longer has a single corporate nexus. That's what you get with cryptocurrency. And yet, all you're seeing is that it is getting increasingly integrated into the global economy, so that every time something like FTX happens, it's going to have more and more ripple effects. 5 years ago, cryptocurrency was more of an island, but there's enough money to be made from it, and there are enough people who see one of the big appeals of cryptocurrency is that it allows attempt to do an end run around local regulations of smaller countries that take out, you know, profits from that are supposed to go to large international banking corporations. So you're going to see that sort of deployment. But because of the nature of it, you know, it makes bailouts a lot harder to even imagine how they would work. You might be able to bail out individual companies, but you know, even they won't have the amount of control they had over their financial products in 2008. So,
you know what I would like to see, though, is I would like to see what happens if we stop believing tech companies when they say, oh, we're doing a thing and it's so different this time. Right? So what crypto did is they said, oh yeah, we're doing a new monetary system. They did exactly the same. They like used the same playbook that the new communalists used about cyberspace. They're like, oh no, this is really different. This is not money like you understand it. This is Bitcoin. It's totally different. It's money. Like the current financial system is just as made up as Bitcoin, right? So who else has done this? Rideshare companies. It's taxis. But they're like, oh no, this is really different. It's not taxis, it's an app. It's happening you know, on your phone. So it's totally different than taxis. And guess what? There's all of the problems of the rideshare companies. So like maybe next time we just don't believe people when they're like, oh no, this is really different because we're doing it on the computer.
I think that this question and both your answers really draw out, again, sorry we keep harping on the supplementary, but I think the kind of things you're talking about, Martin, and the kind of regulation that you're envisioning happening going forward is about not believing them, not letting it go forward to begin with. Mm-hmm. And yet so much has gone forward that we are sort of dwelling, that we have to sort of live with. And we have to talk about that too, the things that have jumped the fence and left the gate. And that's why I'm so happy that you are thinking about these sort of audits and these regulations and like pay your taxes and regulate these things as taxis, as banks, you know. And at the same time, we can't ignore the digital forces that are out, that are you know, just in the wild, right? That David is looking at in his book. We're at time, so if people have to leave, that's fine. But I do want to just let a couple more people ask questions since we have some hands up. So this question in the front, and then Netta, yeah.
Hi, thank you. I'm very excited to read both of your books. I was thinking a lot about the one-sidedness of the tech space throughout both of your talks. David, you brought up an excellent example with the unintended effects of the Aadhaar card system in India. And Meredith, you were talking about the exclusion of diverse thoughts of futurism. And it kind of occurs to me how, after the fact, a lot of our more diverse perspectives of technology is. Like, a lot of this stuff is created with that kind of neoliberal North Californian perspective in mind, and then we think about it after about what's different. And so my question is, what exactly can be done to make sure that these types of perspectives are included before the fact, especially when, like Meredith, you were pointing out the indigenous futurism, Afrofuturism, Eastern types of mentalities around this type of thing, they're usually excluded from these types of discourses in general. So I'm curious, how can we actually shift it if they're never in the dialogue to begin with?
We could destroy the patriarchy.
Do we want to get another question on, just get some questions out there and then sort of selectively answer them, or do you want to respond?
I've got.
Go ahead.
I actually.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that is exactly it. And what Meredith was talking about, the particular sort of John von Neumann post-war situation, definitely set up certain paradigms. The 1956 one, where I think. Herbert Simon and Alan Newell set up, over Christmas break, we built a machine that thinks. And it's like, no, they really said this. And look, I mean, they did some pretty important work. These people were not fools, but they were very blinkered in certain ways. There's a great book by Margaret Bowden called Mind is Machine that traces sort of different currents of cognitive science and computer science thought over I guess the history of computing, and she really, I think, identifies the rationalist strange, which perhaps ironically is very strongly associated with Noam Chomsky, the idea of a certain of generative grammars in different ways being used to produce very controlled phenomena, and the how that paradigm held sway and yet still didn't produce result in the absence of producing any meaningful results, leading to the rise of something that's been much more successful, which is the present deep learning paradigm, so to some extent you can say that science progresses one funeral at a time, but one of the suggestions I give in the book more broadly is that all of these social systems online have been constructed with the implicit assumption that people want to see more of what they like, and this is sort of a hand wave of saying, like, well, tech companies don't really care and don't want to be in the business of picking what people see, other to the extent that it sucks them in, but that's producing homogenizing behavior and homogenizing groups and increasingly sort of hermetic enclaves. And so I think that in the same way that I think you can poison data stores, you can also basically, in a non-targeted way, try to just mix up perspectives. Now, the question is, how do you prevent a flood of garbage from going your way, and how do you prevent companies from saying, oh, well, this is just going to ruin our bottom line? Well, I don't know, but I do think that the more to which you can dissolve these coagulations online, you at least get to start some movement in the direction you're talking about. That's the best I got, but I think that I think that what you raise is a perfectly good point.
Thank you so much for this. I'm very excited to read both books, but I have yet to read them, so I apologize if you answer those questions in the introduction. But I have a question for David and a question for Meredith. So David, it's a terminology question. I'm teaching AI in a liberal arts college in upstate New York, and more and more I find the word the internet to lose meaning, and the distinction, the online-offline distinction. And I'm wondering, so is Meganet, is that the internet by other name, or is that something which is bigger than the internet? And just do you still find the word the internet to be useful for you as a scholar? And then for Meredith, you mentioned some case studies that has to do with racial and gender discrimination, and I wonder if you can say a bit more about disability in relation to the algorithm and how disability plays out to some of the issues that you're studying in the book.
All right. Do you want to start or should I start?
Why don't you start?
All right. So let's talk about disability. Disability, so the book talks about race, gender, and disability. Disability was the thing that I had to learn the most about. I felt like I had a good handle on race and gender, but once I started writing, I realized that I really needed to level up my knowledge around disability issues. So I'm really grateful to the scholars and activists who shared their experiences with me and helped me learn more about it. So I argue for more nuance in the way that we talk about technology and disability, because technology has been really fantastic in increasing access for people with disabilities. And there is still much to be done, right? So we often get caught up in this narrative of having to, of kind of collectively demanding that we pat ourselves on the back for having technology that makes things more accessible, right? But I don't think we need to do that anymore. I think we need to say, yes, we did a good job, and we have a ways to go. So I tell the story in the book of Richard Dan, who worked in an Apple store in Maryland, and he's deaf, and people would come they would drive for hours to come and visit him at the Apple store because he spoke ASL. He spoke American Sign Language, and they could talk to him in their own language, and it's particularly useful to talk to somebody in your own language when you're talking about complex technical topics, right? So he was doing great in his sales role, but one of his managers started giving him a hard time and said, oh, you're not paying enough attention in the staff meetings. And Richard said, well, I'm going to need more accommodation, because the accommodation that had been offered was that a coworker was supposed to type what was happening in the staff meeting so that Richard could read it, because of course he couldn't hear what was happening in the staff meeting. And sometimes a scribe is absolutely the right accommodation. But in this particular case, it wasn't, because the coworker also had to participate in the meeting, and it's very difficult to learn as well as type, right? So things were getting lost, and Richard said, well, I would like a human interpreter, and the company offered a different technological solution. They're like, okay, well, why don't you use speech to text on an iPad? And sometimes that would work really well, because speech to text does work really well nowadays sometimes, but it does not work when you are sitting in the back of a room and there's a speaker at the front of the room who maybe is not using a microphone, right? So the iPad picks up the ambient noise. It doesn't know how to target its focus, right? So when your ears are in okay, actually, I don't know if this is how your ears work, but I know how your eyes work. Your eyes are really good at looking at a panorama and identifying what's important to focus on and just blocking out all of the other input, right? I think we do something similar with our ears, but iPad sensors don't do that, right? So if you're sitting in the back of the room, or if you're interacting with a lot of people in a crowded room, the speech to text is not going to work that well. A human interpreter is going to work really well. And yet, the human interpreter, which would have cost per hour less than an Apple power cord, was repeatedly denied. And Richard's interpretation of that was that the company was really invested in looking at their technologies as sufficient accommodations in all situations, right? So it's a good example of, like, even though we have all of this wonderful technology, we need to be very specific about what tool do we use for the task, and we need to avoid imagining that there's a one-size-fits-all approach to disability. And this is something that comes up over and over again in when technologists design for disability without talking to disabled people. And so what I'm arguing for in this chapter is more nuance and expanding our understanding, and also listening to disabled people and involving more diverse voices in the development process.
You know, it's just interesting. Your use of the word filter is so rich and evocative, and I feel like we could discuss the very notion of filtering. I mean, I just had there's been some work to suggest that schizophrenics have trouble doing the sort of filtering you're talking about, and that their experience of the world is actually some of their different perception is actually because there isn't that singling out of attentive phenomena. And I apologize because I have no way to get a segue from that to my questions. So I'm just going to jump to it, which is the distinction between. I had time to figure out an analogy, which I guess if you think of the internet as like the highway system, a meganet can be thought of as the traffic on it, including the drivers. In other words, that how it is used and manipulated. That in effect it is a layer up, and it is I'd say it's like agnostic to the technology of the internet per se, as long as the technology provides for a certain amount of speed and quantity in there. That's probably the best way I would say it.
Thank you. And you could also say infrastructure, right? And Meredith talks about that as well, and her hope that we will attend to the internet and perhaps to Meganets as well as a kind of infrastructure, the way we would attend to the upkeep of roads, bridges, and so on. So on that note, I'm going to end. Please do come and grab one of these lovely book flyers with QR codes, and thank you very much for coming tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
This has
to
been really wonderful.
our
Thank you so
wonderful
much.
hosts here, and